Hello again, and welcome back. I'm going to continue on with the rest of the story. So, we are going to begin now with chapter 7, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the other home we had, the home under the ground. Now, one of the first things Peter did the very next day was to measure John, Michael, and I for hollow trees. Hook, you remember, had sneered at the boys for thinking they needed a tree apiece. But this was ignorance, for unless your tree fitted you, it was difficult to go up and down, and no two boys were quite the same size. Once you were fitted, you drew in your breath at the top, and down you went at exactly the right speed, while to ascend, you drew in and let out alternately, and so wiggled up. Of course, when you have mastered the action, you were able to do these things without even thinking of them, and nothing could be more graceful. But you must simply fit, and Peter measures you for your tree as carefully as for a suit of clothes. The only difference being is that the clothes are made to fit you, while you have to be made to fit the tree. Now, usually it was done quite easily, as by your wearing too many garments or too few. But if you are bumpy in awkward places, or the only available tree is an odd shape, then Peter does some things to you, and after that you fit. Once you fit, great care must be taken in order to keep fitting. And this, as I discovered to my delight, keeps the whole family in perfect condition. Michael and I fitted our trees at the first try, but John had to be altered a little. Well, after a few days' practice, we could go up and down as gaily as buckets in a well. And how ardently we grew to love our home under the ground. It consisted of one large room, as all houses should do, with a floor in which you can dig for worms if you wanted to go fishing. And in this floor grew stout mushrooms of a charming color, which were used as stools. A never tree tried hard to grow in the center of the floor. By tea time, it was always about 2 feet high, and when they would put a door on top of it, thus it became a table. And soon as they cleared away, they would saw off the trunk again, and thus there was more room to play. There was an enormous fireplace, at which in almost any part of the room where you cared to light it, and across this I would stretch strings from which I suspended the washing. The bed was tilted against the wall by day, but let down by 6:30, and then it nearly filled the half of the room, and all the boys, except Michael, would sleep in it, lying like sardines in a tin. There was a strict rule against turning around until one gave the signal, and then all would turn at once. Michael should have used it also, but I desired to have a baby, and he was the littlest, and so the long and short of it was that he was hung up in a basket. It was rough and simple, and not unlike the baby bears would have made in an underground house in the same circumstances. But there was one recess in the wall, no larger than a bird cage, and this was the private apartment of Tinker Bell. It could be shut off from the rest of the house by a tiny curtain, which Tinker Bell, who was most particular, always kept drawn when dressing or undressing. No woman, however large, could have had a more exquisite dressing room and a bedchamber combined. The couch, as she always called it, was a genuine Queen Mab, with club legs, and she varied her bedsteads according to what fruit blossom was in season. Her mirror was a Puss in Boots, which there were now only 3, chipped, unknown to fairy dealers, and a hand wash was a pie crust, and reversible, a chest of drawers was an authentic Charming the 6th, and the carpets and rugs the best early period of Margery and Robin. There was a chandelier from Tiddlywinks, from the look of it, and of course she lit the residence herself. Tink was very contemptuous of the rest of the house, as indeed was perhaps inevitable, and her chamber, though beautiful, looked rather conceited, having the appearance of a nose permanently turned up. Well, I suppose it was all especially entrancing, because those ambiguous boys of mine gave me so much to do. Really, there were whole weeks when, except perhaps with a stocking in the evening, I was never above ground. The cooking, I can tell you, kept my nose to the pot. And even if there was nothing in it, even if there was no pot, I had to keep watching it, in case it came to a boil just the same. You never exactly knew whether there would be a real meal or just make-believe. It all depended on Peter's whim. Make-believe was so real to him that during a meal, you could see him actually getting rounder and rounder. Of course, it was trying, but you simply had to follow his lead. My favorite time for sewing and darning was after they had all gone to bed. Then I had a breathing time for myself, and I occupied it with making new things for them and putting double pieces on their knees, for they were all most frighteningly hard on their knees. And when I sat down with a basket full of their stockings, every heel with a hole in it, I would fling up my arms and exclaim, "Oh dear, I am sure sometimes think spinsters are to be envied." My face beamed when I exclaimed this. You remember about my pet wolf? Well, it very soon discovered that I had come to the island, and it had found me out. And we just ran into each other's arms, and after that it followed me about everywhere. And as time wore on, did I think much about the beloved parents we had left behind us? Well, this was a difficult question, because it's quite impossible to say how does time wear on in the Neverland, where it is calculated by moons and suns, and there are ever so many more of them here than on the mainland. But I'm afraid I did not really worry about Mother or Father. I was absolutely confident that they would always keep the window open for the three of us to fly back, and this gave me complete ease of mind. What did disturb me at times was that John remembered our parents vaguely only, as people he had once known, while Michael was quite willing to believe that I was really his mother. These things scared me a little, and nobly anxious to do my duty, I tried to fix the old life in their minds by setting them examination papers on it, like the ones I used to do at school. The other boys thought this awfully interesting, and they insisted on joining. And they had made slates for themselves. And so we sat around the table, writing and thinking hard about the questions I had written on another slate and passed around. Now, they were the most ordinary of questions. What was the color of Mother's eyes? Who was taller, Father or Mother? Was Mother blonde or brunette? Answer all three questions if possible. Question A, write an essay of not less than 40 words on how I spent my last holidays, or on the characters of Mother and Father compared. Only one of these must be attempted. Or another question, describe Mother's laugh, describe Father's laugh, describe Mother's party dress, and describe the kennel and its inmate. But these were just everyday questions, And when you could not answer them, you were told to make a cross. It was really dreadful what a number of crosses even John made. Of course, the only boy who replied to every question was Slightly, and no one could have been more hopeful of coming out first, but his answers were perfectly ridiculous, and he really came out last, a melancholy thing. But Peter did not compete. For one thing, he despised all mothers except me. And for another, he was the only boy on the island who could neither write nor spell. Not the smallest word. He was above all that sort of thing. By the way, the questions were all written in past tense. What was the color of mother's eyes, and so on. For you see, I too have been forgetting. Adventures, of course, we shall see, were of daily occurrence, but about the time Peter invented, with my help, a new game had fascinated him immensely, until he suddenly had no more interest in it, which, as you have been told, was what always happened with his games. It consisted in pretending not to have adventures, in doing the sort of thing John and Michael had been doing all of their lives. Sitting on stools, flinging balls in the air, pushing each other, going out for walks, coming back without having killed so much as a grizzly. To see Peter doing nothing on a stool was a great sight. He could not help looking solemn at times. To sit still seemed to him such a comic thing to do, and he boasted that he had gone walking for the good of his health. For several suns, these were the most novel of all adventures to him, and John and Michael had to pretend to be delighted also. Otherwise, he would have treated them very severely. He often went out alone, and when he came back, you were never absolutely certain whether he had an adventure or not. He might have forgotten it so completely that he said nothing about it. And then, when you went out, you found the body. Or, on the other hand, he would say a great deal about it, and yet you would not find the body. Sometimes he came home with his head bandaged, and I cooed over him and bathed it with lukewarm water while he told a dazzling tale. But I was never quite sure, you know. There were, however, many adventures which I knew to be true because I was in them myself. And there were still more that were at least partly true, for the other boys were in them, and they said they were wholly true. To describe them all would require a book as large as an Latin-English dictionary. And the most we can do is give one as a specimen of an average hour on the island. The difficulty is which one to choose. There was a brush with the natives at Slightly Gulch. It was a cheerful affair, and especially interesting as showing one of Peter's particularities, which was that in the middle of a fight, he would suddenly switch sides. At the Gulch, when victory was still in the balance, sometimes leaning this way or that way, he called out, "I'm native today. What are you, Toodles?" And Toodles answered, "Native." "What are you, Nibs?" And Nibs said, "Native." "What are you, Twin?" And so on and so forth. And then they were all natives. And of course this would have ended the fight, had not the real natives, fascinated by Peter's methods, then agreed to be lost boys for that once. And so they went at it again more fiercely than ever. Well, perhaps a better one would be the night attack by the natives on the house under the ground, where several of them got stuck in the hollow trees and then had to be pulled out like corks. Or about the cake that the pirates cooked so that the boys might eat it and perish, and how they placed it in one cunning spot after another. But I always snatched it away from the hands of my children, so that in time it had lost its succulence and became as hard as a stone, and it was used as a missile, and Hook fell over it in the dark. Or I could tell of the birds that were Peter's friends, particularly of the Never bird that built in a tree overhanging the lagoon. And one day how its nest fell into the water, and still the bird sat on it with her eggs. And Peter gave orders that she was not to be disturbed. Oh, that is a pretty story, and it shows how grateful the bird can be. But if I tell you, then I must also tell you about the whole adventure of the lagoon, which would of course be telling about two adventures rather than just one. A shorter adventure, but quite as exciting, was Tinkerbell's attempt, with the help of some street fairies, to have me conveyed on a great floating leaf to the mainland. But unfortunately, the leaf gave way, and I woke up thinking that it was simply bath time and just swam back to Neverland. Or it could be the story of Peter's defiance of the lions, when he drew a circle around him on the ground with an arrow and then dared them to cross it. And he waited for hours while the other boys and I were looking breathlessly from the trees. Not one of them dared to accept his challenge. Ooh, or there's the story of how Peter saved Tiger Lily's life in the Mermaid's Lagoon, and then they became allies. Oh, there are just so many to choose. I know. I'm going to think about which story I'll share with you next. I just need a little time to decide which one. But until then, I'll leave you here, and then we'll come back and share the story. Oh, which one? Until then, take care. Bye. The mermaid, Never bird. Oh, the lions. Oh, the cake. Ooh.